Have you ever been absolutely certain that something happened because of something else, and only later realized that perhaps it was exactly the opposite? Think about it for a moment. A strange sensation in your body, a strong feeling, a sudden emotion. Then something happens, and almost automatically your brain connects the dots and concludes, I felt why that was going to happen, but what if that certainty was built up? After what if the explanation that seems so logical now wasn't the cause, but just a story created to justify what you were already feeling? Have you ever experienced this? What's most unsettling is that when the brain switches cause and effect, everything seems to make sense. The narrative becomes cohesive, comfortable, convincing. It doesn't sound like a mistake. It doesn't sound like confusion. It sounds like the truth. That's precisely why this phenomenon is so difficult to perceive, and so easy to believe. From a very young age, we learn to see the world as an organized sequence of causes and consequences. Something happens, this generates something else, which leads to a final result. This logic gives us security, makes us feel in control. But the human brain doesn't work like a camera that records events in chronological order. It works like a storyteller. And stories need to make sense, even when reality doesn't. The problem begins when an emotion arises before any clear explanation. Anxiety, fear, euphoria, discomfort. The brain doesn't like this emptiness. It doesn't tolerate the absence of meaning for long. So it does what it knows best. It looks for a cause. And if it doesn't find a real cause, it creates one. It rearranges events, adjusts memory, reverses logic, all so that the feeling doesn't seem gratuitous. What you're about to discover might surprise you. Because most of the time, this reversal happens without you realizing it. You feel it first. The explanation comes later. But your mind presents this explanation as if it had always been there, as if it were obvious, inevitable, true. And the stronger the emotion involved, the more compelling the story becomes. Perhaps that's why so many people are certain they already knew something would go wrong. Or why they interpret a feeling of unease as proof of a future event. Or why they revisit the past with the feeling that everything was written from the beginning. The brain takes loose fragments, sensations, memories, results, and assembles a coherent narrative, even if it needs to reverse the order between cause and effect. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this mechanism changes the way you see your decisions, your memories, and even your deepest beliefs. When we look closely, we realize that many of the convictions we hold are not born from facts, but from interpretations constructed after an emotional impact. The brain is not concerned with being faithful to reality. It is concerned with being consistent. And consistency for it is more important than truth. This is where the so-called strange phenomena of the human brain emerge. Not as visible glitches, but as silent adjustments. Small internal edits that transform sensations into explanations, effects into causes, conclusions into starting points. All this happens behind the scenes of the mind, while you continue to believe that you simply understood what happened. This way of looking at how the mind works, deeper, less comfortable, and far more honest, is the kind of reflection that defines the philosophical essence of dark human science, not to offer easy answers, but to question certainties that seem too solid. Now that this idea has been planted, the unsettling question that lingers is, how many times have you explained your own life starting from the end, without realizing it? In the next part, we'll delve even deeper into this mechanism, understanding how the brain constructs these inversions and why they seem so real at the moment they happen. And if, at any point in this video, something sounded too familiar, perhaps it's not a coincidence. Perhaps it's because this mechanism has already acted in your life more times than you imagine. And that's precisely why I want to hear from you now. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. A situation, a hunch, a certainty that you only began to question later. When you write, you're not just telling a story, you're helping other people realize they're not alone in this silent experience. This space isn't just about watching. It's about sharing. Each comment expands the conversation, deepens the topic, and allows this content to reach people who may be experiencing this exact same kind of internal turmoil without being able to put it into words. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and bring this kind of reflection to more people who need to hear it. And if, while you're listening, you feel that this content deserves to continue existing, liking the video is a simple, but powerful, way to signal that. It's not just a click. It's a silent push to ensure that this type of deeper, less obvious approach continues to be produced. Now, if you realize that these topics make you think, bother you in a good way, and make you look at your own mind differently, signing up is almost a natural gesture. It's saying, I want to continue exploring this. It's about being part of a community that prefers thought-provoking questions to easy answers. And while you're doing that, hold on to that feeling with you. Because from here on out, we're going to delve even deeper into how the brain constructs these internal narratives, and why often they seem more real than the facts themselves. There is something profoundly human, and at the same time profoundly invisible, happening all the time inside our minds. The brain simply doesn't deal well with chance. It doesn't like blank spaces, isolated events, unexplained sensations. For it, the world needs to make sense even when it doesn't. And that's exactly where one of the most silent and powerful errors of human experience is born: the almost compulsive need to create a cause for everything. When something happens without a clear explanation, the brain goes on alert. Not a conscious alert, but a subtle, almost imperceptible discomfort. It's as if the mind is saying, "This can't stay like this." And then, without asking permission, it begins to work behind the scenes. It searches through memories, emotions, past patterns, anything that might help build a coherent narrative. It doesn't matter if that narrative is true. What matters is that it's convincing enough to restore a sense of order. That's why quick explanations are so seductive. They provide relief. They close the loop. They give us back a sense of control. The problem is that often these explanations don't describe what really happened. They only explain what we're already feeling. The effect comes first. The cause is created later. But the mind reorganizes everything as if that had always been the order. This mechanism doesn't arise because the brain is flawed, but because it's efficient. Throughout our journey as a species, survival has meant detecting patterns quickly. Those who took too long to explain a noise in the dark or a strange sensation in their body simply didn't survive. The brain learned that it's better to err in explaining than to be paralyzed by uncertainty. But this same mechanism, which was once vital, now distorts decisions, beliefs, and interpretations of reality. And the most curious thing is that this happens precisely when we believe we are being rational. The mind creates cause and effect relationships so naturally that we rarely question them. An emotion arises, a result appears, and that's it. The story is complete. The logic seems solid. The conclusion seems obvious. But if we look more carefully, we realize that the explanation came to justify a feeling, not to describe it. This inversion has a profound impact on how we perceive our own lives. How many decisions have been made based on certainties born from momentary emotions? How many times has an internal feeling been treated as proof of something external? The brain is extremely skilled at transforming internal states into apparent truths about the world. And the stronger the emotion, the more convincing the explanation seems. There's a hidden truth in this process. The brain isn't committed to objective reality. It's committed to internal coherence. It wants everything to make sense within the story you tell yourself. This explains why two people can experience the same event and come away with completely different interpretations. Each brain organizes the facts according to its own emotions, memories, and expectations. This invisible error shapes entire mindsets. It influences how we interpret the past, how we justify choices, and how we anticipate the future. It silently transforms our beliefs, reinforcing narratives that seem logical but are often merely comfortable. It is in the background of the mind that these small distortions accumulate, creating a sense of clarity that may actually be sustained by inverted relationships. And perhaps the most unsettling thing is realizing that this process rarely sounds like a mistake. It sounds like insight, like a revelation, like that moment when everything finally falls into place. The brain loves these moments because they reduce the anxiety of not knowing. But this reduction comes at a cost: the loss of curiosity, of healthy doubt, of the willingness to question. When the brain invents a cause, it ends the investigation. It says, "We don't need to go any deeper." And that's exactly where many internal journeys are interrupted too soon. The person feels they understand, when in reality they've only closed off a provisional story. The quick explanation becomes an anchor. And based on it, future decisions are made as if that narrative were an indisputable fact. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding this error isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a shift in perspective. It's about starting to observe your own mind in action. It's about noticing how certain conclusions arise too quickly, how some certainties seem solid without ever having been tested. When you start to notice this, something interesting happens. The world becomes less obvious but much more honest. This understanding opens the door to more conscious choices, to less reactive decisions, to a more mature relationship with one's own emotions. It's not about distrusting everything, but about recognizing that the brain, in its eagerness to explain, sometimes reverses the order of events, and convinces us of this with impressive skill. And while this idea settles within you, observe how much it already resonates with your own experience. Because, on some level, everyone has lived through moments when the explanation seemed perfect, until it stopped seeming so. It is at this point that curiosity begins to breathe again, and the journey truly starts. Before moving on, if any part of this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. At some point in life, almost everyone has gone through a similar experience, even if they've never put it into words. You wake up with a strange feeling, a weight on your chest, a restlessness that's hard to explain. It's not pain, it's not exactly fear, it's just a diffuse discomfort. You go through the day trying to ignore it, but something goes wrong. A conversation ends badly, bad news arrives, a plan falls apart. And then, almost automatically, the brain completes the equation. I felt it because, deep down, I already knew it was going to happen. This conclusion seems so natural that it is rarely questioned. On the contrary, it brings relief. It gives the feeling that there is a logic behind the chaos, that nothing happened by chance. The problem is that, in this process, the brain has just reversed the order of events. The sensation came first. The event came later. But the mind reorganized everything as if the sensation were a kind of warning, an almost mystical intuition, when in fact it may have been just an emotional state without a defined cause. This type of role reversal is strongly evident in relationships. Think about how many times someone says, "I already felt awkward around this person. Something told me it wasn't going to work out." When a relationship ends, this phrase takes on the status of proof. The brain looks back and constructs a perfect narrative, where the initial discomfort becomes a signal, and the end becomes confirmation. But rarely does it question whether that discomfort might have stemmed from old insecurities, past experiences, or even the simple fear of commitment. The same thing happens with important decisions. A career choice, for example. You accept a path, feel insecure, face difficulties, and then conclude, "I knew I shouldn't have done that." The brain erases all contextual variables, ignores external factors, and transforms an initial emotion into an absolute cause. The hidden truth is that insecurity didn't predict the outcome. It merely coexisted with it. But the mind prefers to believe there was some kind of internal warning, because that gives the feeling of control over one's own destiny. In healthcare, this mechanism can be even more intense. A feeling of unease arises, days later a diagnosis arrives, and the person begins to believe that the body already knew. This idea spreads quickly because it is comforting. It creates a narrative in which nothing was unexpected. However, often the initial discomfort was not directly related to the problem discovered later. It was simply the brain connecting dots that were not necessarily linked, stitching together a coherent story based on the emotional impact of the diagnosis. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this everyday example reveals something essential about the human mindset. The brain cannot tolerate the idea that important events can happen without warning. It needs to believe that there were signs, clues, premonitions. This transforms chance into destiny and effect into cause. It's a silent revelation about how we deal with uncertainty. Behind the scenes of the mind, this process happens so quickly that it seems intuitive. But it has a real impact on how we perceive our own abilities. When we believe we already knew, we reinforce a false sense of predictability. This shapes future decisions, creates overconfidence, or, in other cases, increases the fear of making mistakes. The inner journey becomes guided not by facts, but by the stories we tell ourselves about them. This pattern also influences how we judge other people. When something goes wrong, it's common to hear phrases like, "It was obvious that this was going to happen." But this obviousness only exists after the result. Before, there was uncertainty, multiple possibilities, open paths. The brain erases this complexity and reconstructs the past as if everything had been predictable from the beginning. This is not retrospective wisdom, it is a comfortable distortion. The most curious thing is that this type of inversion rarely generates doubt. On the contrary, it generates conviction. The person feels enlightened, as if they had had a profound insight about themselves or about the world. This feeling of clarity is extremely seductive. It closes questions, reduces the discomfort of ambiguity, and offers a simple explanation for something complex. But explanations that are too simple often hide much more than they reveal. When we begin to observe this pattern closely, we realize how much it influences our personal transformation. Many behavioral changes don't stem from objective facts, but from internal narratives created after emotionally significant experiences. The brain takes the impact, looks back, and rewrites the story to make everything seem inevitable. This creates a false sense of learning, when in reality there may have only been emotional adaptation. This perception changes how we view our own journey. It invites a more curious and less conclusive stance. Instead of thinking, I already knew, perhaps the most honest question is, what was I feeling at that moment? This simple shift in focus opens up space for more conscious decisions and a healthier relationship with uncertainty. And as you follow this line of reasoning, perhaps some personal experiences are coming to mind. Situations where everything seemed to make sense only afterward. Moments when an emotion became an explanation, and the explanation became truth. This is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of humanity. The brain does this because it was shaped for it. Before moving on, if this reflection resonates with something you've experienced, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. When we begin to observe this phenomenon more closely, something becomes clear. What seems like confusion is, in fact, an extremely organized mechanism working behind the scenes of the mind. Nothing happens by chance inside the brain. There is a sequence, but it's not the sequence we imagine. First comes the emotion. Always. Before logic, before explanation, before the story. A bodily sensation, a tightness, a sudden excitement, a diffuse discomfort. Something manifests in the body and mind without asking permission. This emotion doesn't appear with a caption. It simply appears. And that's exactly what bothers the brain. Emotion without explanation is noise. It's incomplete information. It's like receiving a message without context. The human brain doesn't tolerate this state well. It was shaped to interpret, classify, predict. Feeling something without knowing why generates instability. It creates a small internal threat. And every threat, however small, demands a response. This is when the brain truly kicks in. It starts searching for a cause. Not an objective, scientific, necessarily real cause. It looks for something that can justify that feeling. It could be a random thought, an old memory, a detail of the environment, a recent event. Anything will do as long as it fits. The brain isn't interested in precision at this moment. It's interested in filling the gap. What's most impressive is the speed at which this happens. This search for an explanation occurs in fractions of a second, outside of conscious awareness. When you realize it, the narrative is already complete. The emotion already has an apparent cause. And this cause seems so obvious that you don't even imagine it was created later. The explanation presents itself as if it had always existed, as if it were the origin of the sensation, when in reality it was just a belated response to the initial discomfort. This is the heart of the mechanism. The explanation comes after the sensation, but the brain reorganizes the experience so that everything seems to have happened in reverse order. Emotion ceases to be a starting point and becomes a confirmation. The causal narrative gains the status of truth. And from there, everything else adjusts around it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this completely changes how we view thoughts, decisions, and even our own identity. Often we believe we are rational because we can explain what we feel. But what really happens is the opposite. We feel first, explain later, and confuse explanation with rationality. This mechanism has a huge impact on mindset. It creates the illusion that we are always in control, that we understand our motives, that our choices follow a clear logic. Behind the scenes, however, the brain is constantly erasing traces of the initial emotional process and highlighting only the final narrative. It's as if it edits its own story before presenting us with the result. This explains why so many decisions seem inevitable when we look back. The explanation created afterward reorganizes the past coherently, clearing contradictions, softening doubts, and eliminating alternative paths that existed at the actual moment of choice. The brain presents a simplified version of the journey, where everything seems to have led exactly to that point. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely discussed. Most of our convictions do not arise from analysis, but from the need to reduce emotional discomfort. Explanation does not come to enlighten the world, but to calm the mind. It functions as a cognitive anesthetic. When the narrative enters the scene, anxiety diminishes. Chaos takes shape. The feeling of threat dissipates. The problem is that this relief comes with a subtle loss. When the brain creates a causal narrative too quickly, it stifles curiosity. It shuts down the investigation. It prevents us from remaining in the I don't know state long enough to learn something new. Real transformation requires tolerating uncertainty, but the brain prefers the safety of a ready-made story. This process profoundly influences how we deal with mistakes, failures, and change. Instead of exploring what really happened, the mind creates a convenient explanation and moves on. This may seem like maturity, but it is often just emotional haste. The journey of self-discovery becomes shallow when the narrative arrives too quickly. And this doesn't only happen on a personal level. This mechanism shapes collective beliefs, social interpretations, and moral judgments. Shared emotions generate shared explanations. Entire groups come to believe in cause and effect relationships that have never been verified, only felt. The impact of this on collective decisions is enormous, because emotions are contagious, and narratives built upon them spread easily. When we begin to see this pattern, something curious happens. We start to realize that many internal revelations are simply stories well told by the brain itself. This doesn't mean that emotions are irrelevant. On the contrary, they are important signals. But a signal is not an explanation. A sensation is not a cause. Confusing these things is what generates the inversion. Observing this mechanism in action is like watching the behind the scenes of your own mind. You begin to notice the exact moment a sensation arises, and the narrative enters the scene soon after, almost glued to it. This perception doesn't eliminate the process, but it creates space. Space to question. Space to choose not to accept the first explanation that appears. This shift in perspective alters the relationship with one's own decisions. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" the question becomes, "What was I feeling when this happened?" It seems subtle, but the effect is profound. The first question seeks an external cause. The second investigates the internal state. That's where the journey gains depth. And as this awareness develops, it becomes easier to understand how the brain constructs certainties from fleeting emotions, how it transforms sensations into absolute truths, and how this guides future choices without us even realizing it. This understanding doesn't close anything. On the contrary, it opens a door to continue exploring how these narratives consolidate, repeat themselves, and become part of our identity. If any of this resonates with something you've ever felt or thought, comment below. That makes sense to me. When memory enters this process, everything becomes even more subtle, and much more powerful. Because, contrary to what we learn from an early age, memory doesn't function as a faithful archive of facts. It doesn't record events as they truly were. It records versions. It records stories. Stories that make sense. No, in light of what you know, feel, and believe in the present. This changes everything. Every time you remember something, the brain isn't simply accessing an old record. It's reconstructing that experience in real time. And in this reconstruction, current emotions, recent beliefs, and previously formed conclusions enter like new pieces in an old puzzle. The past doesn't remain intact. It's constantly being re-edited behind the scenes of the mind. This is where the exchange between cause and effect is definitively consolidated. Because when an event gains meaning after it happens, memory takes charge of reorganizing the timeline so that this meaning seems to have been present from the beginning. The brain adjusts details, reinforces sensations, softens contradictions. What was once doubt becomes a sign. What was once chance becomes destiny. The effect begins to appear as a cause. This reorganization doesn't happen consciously. You don't decide to alter your memories. The brain does it automatically as part of a coherence mechanism. It needs your life story to make sense. It needs decisions to seem logical. It needs events to follow a comprehensible narrative. A life without a narrative generates anxiety. A meaningless memory generates instability. So the brain does what it does best. It tells a good story. And the more emotionally charged the event, the more intense this reconstruction will be. Strong emotions act like fresh paint on the past. They color old memories, redefine intentions, and reorganize motivations. A difficult breakup, an unexpected loss, a great achievement. All of these alter how the brain remembers what came before. Memory adapts to the impact. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this process has a direct impact on how you see yourself. Many personal identities are built upon rearranged memories. You believe you've always been this way. That you've always thought this way. That you've always known. But in many cases, these certainties are the result of successive edits made by memory to maintain the coherence of the narrative. The hidden truth is that the past is not static. It is malleable. And this doesn't mean you're consciously inventing things. It simply means that the brain prefers a consistent story to a precise one. It prefers continuity to fidelity. And in this process, small adjustments to the order of events go unnoticed, but produce large effects on mentality. This explains why two people who experience the same situation remember completely different things. Each brain reorganizes the past according to its own emotional needs. Each memory is shaped by the individual journey. What was a clear warning for one person was merely a coincidence for another. Not because one is lying, but because each mind constructed a different story to make sense of the impact experienced. This mechanism also explains why certain decisions seem inevitable when recalled. Memory erases the complexity of the real moment and presents a simplified version of the past, where everything pointed to that outcome. The alternatives disappear. The doubts vanish. The choice seems obvious. But this obviousness is a later creation. Behind the scenes, the brain is constantly protecting the image you have of yourself. Admitting that a decision was made without clarity, or that an outcome was due to chance, threatens that image. So memory kicks in, rearranging the facts to preserve the feeling of control. The final narrative is not constructed to explain the world, but to preserve identity. And it is precisely this type of phenomenon that reveals how much less objective the human mind is than we imagine, and how much more creative. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not easy answers, but the invisible mechanisms that shape perceptions, decisions, and inner truths without us realizing it. When you begin to see memory in this way, something changes. The relationship with the past becomes less rigid. You start to question old certainties, automatic interpretations, stories that always seem too solid. Not to deny everything, but to make room for a more honest understanding of your own journey. This realization has a profound impact on personal transformation. It invites a more curious and less defensive stance. Instead of protecting old narratives, you begin to observe them. Instead of repeating ready-made explanations, you start to investigate them. The journey ceases to be about confirming what you already believe and becomes about understanding how those beliefs were constructed. And as this awareness grows, it becomes impossible not to notice how many times the brain adjusts the past to justify the present. How many times a feeling has become proof. How many times a result has become a cause. How many times memory has worked silently to make everything seem to make sense. This understanding doesn't close the story. On the contrary, it creates an opening, a crack through which new questions begin to emerge. Because, if memory rewrites the past, what else is it still reorganizing now while you listen to this? If this idea resonates with you, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. At some point along this path, an inevitable question arises. If all of this is a construct, why does it seem so real? Why doesn't this inversion of cause and effect sound strange, generate distrust, or raise internal alarms? On the contrary, it presents itself with an almost hypnotic force, as if it were a belated revelation, a truth that has finally come to light. The answer lies in a fundamental characteristic of the human brain. It wasn't designed to seek objective truth. It was designed to maintain coherence. For it, a coherent story is more valuable than a true story. Coherence reduces anxiety. Coherence generates predictability. Coherence creates the feeling that the world is understandable and therefore habitable. When the brain finds a narrative that connects emotion, memory, and end result, it feels safe. It matters little whether the order of events was respected or not. It matters little if the logic is reversed. What matters is that everything fits in. And when everything fits in, the mind relaxes. This feeling of relief is often mistaken for certainty. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this certainty doesn't stem from reason. It stems from emotion. Emotionally intense events activate regions of the brain that increase the subjective feeling of conviction. It's as if emotion acts as an internal amplifier. The stronger the emotional impact, the truer the explanation seems, even when it doesn't hold up logically. That's why, after significant events, people often say things like, "I always knew it, it was obvious, it was inevitable." The brain looks back through emotionally charged lenses and reinterprets everything. The intensity of the experience gives the narrative extra weight. It not only makes sense, it seems obvious. And what seems obvious is rarely questioned. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. The confidence we feel in an explanation isn't a reliable indicator of its accuracy. It's merely an indicator of its emotional satisfaction. The brain confuses cognitive comfort with truth. When a story alleviates internal discomfort, it gains the status of fact. This mechanism has a profound impact on mindset. It shapes rigid convictions, unwavering opinions, and absolute certainties. People can defend completely misguided explanations with impressive confidence, not because they have deeply analyzed the facts, but because the constructed narrative fits perfectly into their lived emotional experience. And the more emotionally involved someone becomes with a story, the harder it becomes to abandon it. Questioning the narrative begins to seem like a threat, not only to the explanation but to one's own identity. After all, admitting that the cause was created after the effect means accepting that we are not always in control, that we do not always understand what we feel, that we do not always know why we do what we do. The brain avoids this type of discomfort. It protects the coherence of the personal story as a precious asset. Behind the scenes, it reinforces the narrative, revisits memories, selects evidence that confirms the explanation, and ignores everything that could contradict it. This process happens automatically, silently, almost elegantly. That's why the inversion seems so convincing. It doesn't appear as a mistake but as clarity. It doesn't sound like confusion but like insight. The person feels they have reached a mature, profound, definitive conclusion. And this feeling is reinforced by the very functioning of the brain, which rewards coherence with emotional relief. This pattern powerfully influences future decisions. Once the mind believes it already knew, it begins to rely even more on similar feelings in the future. Gut feelings gain exaggerated weight. Emotions become arguments. The personal journey begins to be guided more by internal narratives than by careful observation of reality. And this doesn't only happen in personal situations. This same mechanism operates in social, professional, and even collective contexts. Major decisions can be justified by explanations that seem solid, but which were constructed after the emotional impact of the outcome. The confidence with which they are defended deceives not only the speaker, but also the listener. When we begin to see this process clearly, something changes in the way we deal with certainties. The question ceases to be, is this true? And becomes, does this make sense because it's true or because it's comfortable? This shift in perspective doesn't provide ready-made answers, but it opens up space for a more honest understanding of one's own mind. This awareness also transforms the relationship with error. Instead of seeing it as a character flaw or lack of intelligence, it comes to be understood as part of the natural functioning of the brain. The mind doesn't err through carelessness. It errs through efficiency. It prefers a good story now to a long and uncertain investigation. And as this idea takes hold, it becomes impossible not to notice how many everyday certainties are sustained more by emotion than by logic. How many explanations seem irrefutable simply because they were built upon intense experiences? How many truths do we carry that may just be very well-constructed narratives? This recognition doesn't close anything. It creates an opening, a new curiosity, a different disposition to observe thoughts, decisions, and memories more carefully. Because if certainty can be born from inversion, then perhaps doubt is a sign of maturity, not weakness. And as this reflection takes shape, you realize how it naturally leads to other questions. If the brain prioritizes coherence over truth, what happens when two coherent narratives conflict? How do we choose which one to believe? It is at this point that the conversation begins to get even deeper. If this part made sense to you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When this reversal between cause and effect goes unnoticed, it ceases to be merely a curious detail of mental functioning and begins to produce very real consequences in daily life. And the most dangerous thing is that these consequences rarely attract attention right away. They disguise themselves as intuition, prudence, emotional responsibility. But, little by little, they shape decisions, behaviors, and even the way a person relates to themselves. One of the most common effects appears in decision-making based on signals. The person feels something, a tightness, a doubt, a fear, and instead of treating it as an emotion that deserves to be understood, transforms it into a message. The brain interprets the sensation as a warning, as if the body were anticipating the future. And then important decisions begin to be made not from analysis, but from this internal narrative that seems loaded with meaning. The problem isn't in listening to emotions. The problem is in treating them as evidence. When this happens, choices cease to be evaluated by their real impact and begin to be filtered by the fear of repeating an uncomfortable feeling. The brain creates shortcuts. The last time I felt this and it went wrong, so now this is a signal not to go. The inversion closes in a perfect cycle. Emotion becomes cause. The cause becomes rule. The rule begins to guide life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this pattern has a direct impact on how guilt takes hold. When something goes wrong, the brain revisits the past in search of ignored signs. And it almost always finds them. An old doubt, a forgotten comment, a vague feeling. All of this is reorganized by memory as if it were a clear warning that went unheeded. The conclusion comes down hard: I should have known. This guilt is unfair because it stems from a false reconstruction. In reality, that wasn't an obvious sign. It was just one emotion among many others. But the brain, after the impact of the mistake, needs to explain what happened. And the quickest explanation is to transform the emotion into a warning and the person into the guilty party. This generates a feeling of personal failure that doesn't correspond to the reality of the decision-making process. This type of guilt doesn't educate. It paralyzes. The person begins to doubt themselves, their own ability to choose, their own perception. Every future decision becomes accompanied by a silent fear of making the same mistake again, of not hearing the signals, of ignoring something the body is trying to say. The brain creates an internal environment of constant vigilance. And that's exactly where fears begin to reinforce themselves. An initial emotion becomes a narrative. The narrative becomes a rule. The rule generates avoidance. Avoidance prevents new experiences. And the absence of new experiences confirms the original fear. The cycle closes without ever having been tested against reality. Not because the person is weak or confused, but because the brain has found an efficient shortcut to avoid discomfort. This process is extremely common in anxiety, but it's not limited to it. It appears in relationships, career, health, and everyday choices. Small reversals accumulate and, over time, build a mindset based more on protection than exploration. The personal journey becomes narrow. Possibilities diminish. And all of this seems like prudence, when in reality it's well-organized fear. It's important to make something very clear here. This isn't madness. It's not a lack of control. It's not a character flaw. It's a shortcut the brain uses. A mechanism created to reduce uncertainty and suffering in the short term, even if it creates limitations in the long term. The brain isn't trying to sabotage you. It's trying to protect you. But sometimes this protection comes at too high a price. Behind the scenes, the brain prefers a predictable world to a broad one. It prefers closed narratives to open possibilities. And when the inversion between cause and effect becomes frequent, the person begins to live more in a reconstructed past than in the real present. Decisions begin to be made based on edited memories and reinterpreted emotions, not on facts observed now. The impact of this on personal transformation is profound. Change requires risk. It requires entering territories where uncomfortable emotions arise without immediate explanation. But if every uncomfortable emotion is interpreted as a sign of error, change becomes almost impossible. The person confuses growth with danger and stability with security. And, little by little, life is guided by internal narratives that seem very convincing, but which have never been questioned. Stories about who you are, about what works for you, about what you weren't born to do. Many of these stories didn't come from facts, but from emotions that were transformed into absolute truths. When this awareness begins to emerge, something shifts internally. The person starts to realize that not all fear is a warning, that not every sensation is a sign, that not every certainty came before the event. This awareness doesn't eliminate the mechanism, but it creates a space between feeling and concluding. And this space changes everything. Because it is in this interval that new decisions can be made. Less reactive decisions. More conscious decisions. Decisions that consider emotions but do not blindly submit to them. The journey ceases to be guided by old narratives and begins to be built with more presence. And as this idea settles in, it becomes impossible not to notice how it naturally opens up other questions. If so many choices were influenced by silent reversals, what happens when we begin to dismantle these narratives? What remains when the brain stops using shortcuts and has to deal with uncertainty head-on? If this part relates to something you've experienced, comment below. I'm on this journey too. There's a very subtle, yet transformative, point in this whole process. The moment you begin to realize that your brain is switching everything. Not as a glaring error, not as something obvious, but as a small internal shift. An almost imperceptible detail. And learning to notice this detail doesn't require technique, doesn't require complex training, doesn't require any magic formula. It requires presence. Generally, the first sign appears when the explanation comes too quickly. So quickly that it feels comfortable. You feel something and, before you can even sustain the sensation for a few seconds, your mind already offers a ready answer. It's because of this, this means that, I already know what's happening. This speed is not clarity. It's premature closure. The brain didn't wait for data, didn't observe the context, didn't explore alternatives. It simply rushed to eliminate the discomfort of not knowing. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this speed is often mistaken for emotional intelligence or maturity. But often, it's just anxiety disguised as certainty. When the explanation comes too quickly, it's worth turning on a small inner light. Not to reject the explanation but to question the timing. Silently ask yourself, did this come after observation or did it come to end the discomfort? Another sign appears when emotion begins to be treated as proof. Not as data, not as information but as definitive evidence. Internal phrases like, if I felt it, it must be true, seem intuitive, almost noble. But they carry a serious problem. They transform internal states into external facts. The brain makes this conversion easily because emotion is intense, vivid, convincing. But intensity is not a criterion of truth. When emotion becomes an argument, the space for questioning disappears. The mind closes in on the sensation and begins to construct justifications to support it. Fear becomes a warning. Anxiety becomes intuition. Discomfort becomes a sign of error. And the more the emotion is repeated, the stronger the narrative becomes. Not because it was confirmed, but because it was reinforced. There is also a third clue, perhaps the most treacherous of all, when everything seems to make sense but without evidence. It's that moment when the internal story is so well organized that you feel a kind of cognitive relief. The pieces fit together. The timeline seems clear. The causes seem obvious. But if someone asked you to point out concrete facts, verifiable data, observable elements, they simply wouldn't be there. This type of coherence is extremely seductive. The brain loves it when everything fits together. It loves it when there's no room for doubt. It loves it when the narrative is elegant. But coherence is not synonymous with truth. It's merely internal consistency. And the brain is an expert at creating consistency even from incomplete information. Understanding this doesn't mean living in constant doubt or distrusting everything all the time. It means developing a more curious and less reactive mindset. Instead of accepting the first explanation that comes along, you begin to observe it. Instead of merging with the emotion, you listen to it. Instead of treating the feeling as a verdict, you recognize it as a signal, not of external reality but of an internal state. This small shift has a huge impact on the personal journey. It creates space. Space between feeling and concluding. Space between reacting and deciding. Space between automatic narrative and a deeper understanding. It is in this space that more conscious choices become possible. Behind the scenes of the mind, the brain continues to function in the same way. It continues to search for patterns, create stories, try to fill in the gaps. The difference is that now you begin to notice the movement. And when something is noticed, it loses some of its automatic power. It doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling itself. This perception also changes the relationship with past mistakes. Instead of looking back with guilt and thinking, "I should have known," a more honest interpretation emerges. "I felt something, interpreted it too quickly, and followed that path." This doesn't diminish responsibility, but it restores humanity to the process. Decisions cease to be judged as moral failings and begin to be understood as the results of a cognitive system seeking protection. And it is precisely this understanding that truly empowers. Not because it offers absolute control, but because it restores awareness. You begin to perceive when a decision is being guided by data and when it is being guided by well-organized fear. You begin to notice when an explanation brings real clarity and when it only brings momentary relief. This change in attitude influences relationships, work, and life choices. Conversations become less defensive. Conflicts are no longer interpreted as immediate personal attacks. Difficult situations are no longer automatically interpreted as signs that something is wrong with you. The internal narrative gains more nuance, more depth, more honesty. And the most interesting thing is that none of this requires strength, extreme discipline, or constant vigilance. It's an adjustment of perspective, a refinement of attention. An invitation to linger a little longer in the "I don't know yet" before accepting, "Now it makes sense." This extra time is uncomfortable, but it's in this time that the transformation happens. As this awareness strengthens, it becomes increasingly clear when the brain is switching cause and effect to protect itself. And at this point, a new, almost inevitable question arises. If it is now possible to perceive the inversion as it happens, what else changes when we stop automatically accepting the stories the mind tells us? If this part resonated with something you've already noticed about yourself, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When we get to this point, something begins to silently shift inside. It's not a conclusion, it's not a closed answer, it's more like a crack in our usual way of thinking. A small doubt that didn't exist before. Because, if all this makes sense, then many of the certainties we carry may not be as solid as they seem. Perhaps they are just well-organized stories that the brain told after everything had already happened. And that idea is not usually comfortable right away. For much of our lives, we learn to trust our own internal explanations. You learn to believe that you understand why you feel what you feel, why you choose what you choose, why certain things happen the way they do. This feeling of understanding becomes part of our identity. Questioning it feels almost like losing your footing. But, at the same time, there is something liberating in realizing that not every certainty needs to be defended. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this initial discomfort isn't a problem, it's a signal. A signal that the mind has switched from automatic mode to observation. When you begin to consider that perhaps the explanation came after the sensation, something changes in the way you look at your own past. Stories that seemed closed gain new layers. Old decisions cease to seem so obvious. Emotions that previously served as proof are now seen as part of the context, not as a sentence. This shift has a direct impact on mindset. Instead of constantly trying to confirm old narratives, you begin to open yourself to more honest revelations. Revelations that don't come as ready-made answers, but as better questions. And better questions broaden the journey rather than limiting it. Do you realize how, throughout all of this, the brain was constantly trying to help? It wasn't deceiving you out of malice. It was protecting you. Protecting you from chaos, from chance, from uncertainty. The problem isn't this impulse. The problem is when it goes unnoticed and transforms into absolute truth. When stories created to alleviate discomfort become permanent maps for a lifetime. When this happens, decisions cease to be reviewed. Fears cease to be questioned. Guilt ceases to be put into perspective. The narrative gains more weight than the reality in motion. And the person begins to live trying to be consistent with old stories, instead of responding to what is really happening now. But when this awareness arises, something opens up. You begin to notice that you can feel without concluding. You can remember without closing. You can decide without transforming emotion into proof. This doesn't make life simpler, but it makes it more real. More aligned with the fact that human beings don't function like logical machines, but rather as emotional systems that later learn to tell stories about themselves. This perception also changes your relationship with other people. Judgments become less harsh. Certainties about others' intentions become less absolute. You begin to see that, just like you, everyone else is also operating from internal narratives, often constructed after an emotional impact. This doesn't justify everything, but it humanizes you a lot. And perhaps the most interesting part of this reflection is realizing that it doesn't require you to abandon your stories. It simply invites you to hold on to them with less rigidity, to allow them to be revised, to accept that some certainties were useful at a certain point, but perhaps they no longer need to dictate future decisions. In essence, all of this leads us to a simple, yet profoundly unsettling question. A question that doesn't demand an immediate or definitive answer. A question that acts like a nagging feeling, persistent, silent, and difficult to ignore once it appears. What if many of the certainties you hold aren't causes, but effects that your brain explained later? If this question has been echoing inside you, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it probably wasn't by chance. Perhaps some part of this conversation resonated with you in a different way. Not as a ready-made answer, but as a question that stayed with you. And when content manages to do that, when it stays with you long after the video ends, it's because there's something alive there. If this reflection made you stop, reconsider a certainty, or see an old situation from a different angle, subscribing to the channel is just a way of saying, I want to continue exploring this type of idea. Here, each video is an extension of that same conversation. Deep, curious, and without easy shortcuts. If you feel like it, leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something simple like, this message was for me. Sometimes, putting it into words helps to organize what's been echoing inside. And if this video created a connection with you, liking it is a small gesture, but it supports this type of content. There's a video over here that complements this reflection and takes this idea even further. Click and continue reading with me there. Sometimes, one question leads to another, and that's how the mind begins to transform. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality,